What's up guys, my name is Fari and in today's video I'm going to be going through a CEO dashboard that I'm actively building. This is ultimately built to track cash collected, contract value, clients closed, and also total sales calls booked. This can be plugged into any backend. Mainly this one is going to be used for G Sheets, basically Google Sheets, and I'm going to be going through how it works and how I'm actively thinking about implementing different things in terms of both on the front end and also on the back end. So without further ado, let's jump straight into it. So if we can see the first thing that we see specifically on this dashboard, the main use case and the idea around this is ultimately to have this as a source of truth for our clients, ultimately to have this one consolidated dashboard that is ultimately able to pull in various different amounts of data into one consolidated place, making sure that each and every single day our clients are ultimately able to just view this one specific dashboard. You can plug this into Retool, for example, and then you can have basically different relational databases that are connected to this, and also just using G Sheets in this instance. But ultimately this mockup gives me an idea in terms of how it's going to be built, what are the specific data pools that we're ultimately going to be able to pull in, and what is actively going to be useful. Because I think it's one thing ultimately just building a dashboard without actively mocking it up, because I think this is one of the most important things in terms of mocking up first and then ultimately building the dashboard, and then you can know which data will be plugged into where and how it will interact specifically for the client that we're working for. So it's a specific use case that we're basically building this for. So enough rambling. The main idea about this is ultimately to basically know what cash collected we have, what is the contract value and the clients closed, and also the total sales calls booked. So if we look into the left quadrant of this, we have two specific quadrants where we can see cash collected. This would be the yearly, so basically making sure that we're pulling data from the yearly cash collected. So in Google Sheets terms, we ultimately have a spreadsheet where we then calculate the total per month, and then each and every single month is calculated, and then we have the yearly. So then we have a filter here where we can just filter this simply by closer A. This use case is super important, especially for people or coaches that don't know what their specific cash collected is. This ultimately allows them to have an overview in terms of their cash collected and also contract value, and this is contract value that is based off of one specific material or one specific product that they're selling, to make sure that they're understanding their metrics in terms of the contract value that they have, and also clients closed, basically total clients closed per year. So this can be filtered out specifically on different closers. So if you have closer A, closer B, and closer C, you can ultimately see how many clients they have closed and also the total sales calls that they've been taking. And this is also super important because if you're able to just understand these metrics in this format, I think you can use this as a source of truth that ultimately guides how your sales team is ultimately performing and also how the business is performing as well. And then if we look onto the right quadrant, I know it says yearly 2 times, but this is ultimately for the monthly. So ultimately monthly cash collected and then contract value. I know the cash collected here is like 5.5 million, but this is ultimately just dependent. It's just a mock-up. So then we ultimately see the contract value here and the clients closed as well, and the total sales calls. So this might need to add more metrics depending on what would be needed to have on this specific one, and then ultimately make sure that we have the total sales calls that are booked over here, and then we have this, and then we have a percentage of it underneath. So the main use case for this is ultimately to guide the team in terms of understanding what their metrics are, and the number one step is ultimately being able to plan it. So we can also see the offer performance charts, basically a different bar charts that shows specifically the calls on calendars, offers made, and closes closed, basically having this as a key metric in terms of understanding what they're building. Because if you have all these consolidated in one place, that ultimately gives you the data points that you can ultimately use in terms of decision making as well. So you have your monthly, and then you have your yearly over here, and then you ultimately have your show rates. Your show rates are ultimately super important because the total calls on your calendar versus total shown is ultimately going to be a key metric that you're going to be focusing on, making sure that you're basically focusing on, you know, what you're building in terms of your show rates, how many people are actively showing up to the sales calls. Because if you understand these metrics, then you can understand on the back end what kind of automation triggers you need to send. For example, let's say you have a low show rate, and simply because you have no follow-up process in terms of, you know, making sure that the prospect is getting on the sales call, what you can do is ultimately send SMS reminders, and you can also plug in these SMS reminders specifically on here to also have that those metrics as well. How many people are, you know, confirming through SMS reminders and also email reminders. You need to have another table or another bar graph for this to basically have, you know, total email sent versus calls booked through messaging, basically sending a simple message to say, hey, please respond, confirm if you're going to make it to the call that we're going to have. And then ultimately through this, you ultimately use different automations that you can plug on this, and then through this you have your data. You see that 9% of your total prospects are showing up on the sales calls, and then you have this on the monthly view as well, and then you have your cash collected versus contract value. So this is your contract value per specific prospect. This main idea is ultimately to understand what the cash collected is, and also the contract value, basically what is the metrics around this, because this ultimately allows you to understand how much each contract is worth and how much cash you're actively collecting against that specific contract value as well, which ultimately guides you in terms of which specific avenues you need to spend a lot more time in terms of, you know, improving as well. And ultimately connecting this on the back end is ultimately super important as well. But this ultimately needs, you know, the yearly close, calls to close percentage, shows to close, and also offers to close. So basically building this out in terms of, you know, understanding what the percentages are. Specifically for this, I can go into why this is specifically a pie chart. The reason why this is a pie chart is just it's simpler to basically understand percentages when you have a percentage, basically having the percentages for calls to close as a percentage, shows to close, because this ultimately guides you in terms of understanding what percentage is happening in terms of our calls, how many, you know, closers are closing the calls that we're having, and also shows to close, basically how many people are showing up to the calls that we can ultimately close, and also offers to close. So the thing about this is ultimately the key idea or principle around this is ultimately understanding this as a source of truth, because with this source of truth we're then able to understand which specific avenues we're then able to improve on, which ultimately allows us to then build it out, you know, because I think one of the most important things is ultimately mocking it up before building, because I think, you know, the more you're able to do these small little things in terms of fully understanding what it is that you're building, then you're able to fully then build out understanding and having this source of truth that is aligned. Because ultimately if you're using Airtable, then you can know which databases or which relations you need to have. Then we've also just got a basically a summary of everything. Main highlights is basically cash collected, contract value, and clients closed, and the total sales calls, and also then all the other stuff will still be highlighted but will be smaller, just basically showing why percentages we would need, what percentages we would need, basically shows to close, calls to close, and then having performance weekly charts as well, which then we can also plug in, basically having these KPIs, because I think one of the most important things for, you know, businesses is ultimately understanding that you have your key metrics, how are people performing against those key KPIs, and also making sure that everyone is staying above KPIs, because if you're not staying above KPIs, then ultimately you're causing a lot of friction points, if you will, and that ultimately means that we're using a column chart for key metrics, saying for example calls on calendar, offers made, and closes. The number one thing is to make it as simple as possible, so that, you know, when we give or hand this specific dashboard out, it is able to be fully understood. That's why we run through this feedback cycle of also just showing in terms of, you know, this is what makes sense, this is what doesn't make sense, because the more we're able to plan better, then we're able to build a lot better. Because I think 80% of, you know, in the entire building process comes from planning, which basically is you making sure that everyone is aligned in terms of what you're building, for example with this dashboard, and also understanding, you know, how everything is going to be related to each other, because there's no ambiguity, and this is why Killer Chaos OS basically powers how we're basically thinking about building out backend systems and also these dashboards. Because with these dashboards, then we are able to understand from first principles to ask the questions of what are the requirements, what it is that we're actively trying to solve for, and in this specific instance, we're solving for understanding the key metrics that ultimately run the business specifically onto the closers that we have, and through this we're basically able to mock this up and then ultimately build out the entire database and then have the relations that we're gonna be plugging in. So this is also super important because then we have your pie charts, which basically show the percentage like I mentioned, and then we also have a summary at the bottom which basically has your calls on calendar, your live calls, your show percentage, and offers made percentage, and all these different metrics. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think it's pretty simple to go through. And then also show rate section, total calls on calendar versus total shown, and a percentage would need to have a section for that. So this is basically just the ideas that we basically run through, because like I said, 80% solely just comes from planning, and if we're able to then plan more effectively, then we're able to build with no ambiguity, because as soon as we can remove ambiguity, the better we can better plan for specific instances, and also building it modular, which basically means that we can swap different components and make sure that we're not building it in a rigid way, making sure, for example, saying if we're building it in a rigid way, that we only build it in one specific way and no other way. There's no wiggle room in terms of saying we need to solve for another thing. We basically have 2-3 main ideas that we have for this, saying for example we want to make sure that the business we're working with understands their KPIs. So for that we make sure that we have a data focused approach, and also making sure that, hey, let's say into the future they now want to make sure that they're focusing solely on the future growth. So for example, the predictive analysis tool that is going to come into the future, hint for Killer Chaos OS, where we basically are able to forecast how the performance of the business and KPIs is going to be into the future based on historical data. And through that, I know that we're ultimately just going to be able to create a lot more value and make sure that the businesses are powered on the back end, because I think that is one of the most important leverage points to ultimately help our business partners to ultimately create as much leverage as possible. So this specific instance, like I said, can be plugged into Retool. I think Retool will give that level of flexibility, and also Airtable. Also just understanding how it's going to look in terms of the interface on Airtable, then also just having it on Google Sheets. With this specific instance is going to be used for the use case. Ultimately, I think for certain stages and certain phases of a business cycle or a business's life, you ultimately need specific tools, and this mainly would be tailored towards like growth agencies. If you're making say $500,000 a year plus, I think the specific use case for this would ultimately be using Retool, restructuring this in Retool, and then ultimately plugging that in, just ultimately for growth purposes, because you have more flexibility in terms of what you're going to be doing. And I think through this, we're ultimately going to create as much value as we possibly can for our clients. Still in the building phase, like I said, trying to figure out a format that actively works for me, showing you in terms of how I'm thinking about things, how we're actively solving for things as well, because I think that is one of the most important modes that is gonna ultimately build these 365 days of just building each and every single day. And yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what format, like I said, that works. Still thinking that this format might actually be the winner, ultimately just showing you in terms of the dashboards that we're showing, in terms of showing what it is that we're actively focusing on, and how we're also kind of thinking about it, and also striking the balance between showing and also just creating as much value as possible. And like I say, I know we're going to get some things wrong, and I know we're also going to get some things right, but the most important thing is that we keep moving the needle forward and just keep on building, because each and every single day that we build is ultimately a brick into the foundation for Killer Chaos OS, and also for the grand vision that we have for the future, and also hitting these 365 days. I think we're still a very long way, but ultimately it's exciting to just sit down and just rip and just continue building. So I will probably do a part two when the build is ultimately actively done, ultimately just keeping sensitive information away as well, but ultimately just showing you in terms of how it's going to work and the different database relations there are going to be. So I might do that into the future. Yeah, I'll just have to make sure of it. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.